Hey, it's Drybear. We're almost done with our series covering every single weapon in the First Descendant, and today we're going to talk about the last scout rifle on our list, the Wave of Light. So we've gone through all of the normal scout rifles, and we even talked about Blue Beetle, which almost broke 800,000 DPS when maxed. And the question was, could Wave of Light match this? And the answer is absolutely yes. In fact, I think it's safe to say that the Wave of Light is actually the best scout rifle in the entire game, and there's two different builds that we'll talk about. One that is going to be the optimal build, but requires you to play a specific way, and then I'll give you a backup basic build in case you don't want to play that way. So this would be the basic build for Wave of Light that just focuses on the way you play with scout rifles in general. We're going to be running with Real Life Fighter as your biggest, but if you wanted to, you could swap out for Mental Focus, Sharp Precision Shot, or Elemental Conductor, and it depends on whether you want to use the stacking portion of the Real Life Fighter. Some people don't like to do that or aim for weak points, and so you could very easily swap that out for something that's a little bit more consistent, that doesn't require you to be precise. Of course, we're still going to have Rifling Reinforcement, Action Reaction, Elemental, and it actually scales really well with Recycling, Genius, two reload mods, and then a one round mod, weak point and fire rate up. This just gives you a very easy way to hit this. These weapons are incredibly precise. Any weapon that has a scope on it is going to allow you to very consistently hit the enemy. The recoil's not bad either, even with have aiming or Real Life Fighter on top of it, which gives you a lot of flexibility there. It doesn't scale as well with things like Special Sight or Weak Point Expansion because it's not as bursty as things like the Perforator or Nazastra's Devotion, so you focus more on kind of like pure throughput DPS rather than burst DPS in that case. The stat priority is going to be Firearm Attack, the flat elemental damage from Firearm Attack, which currently only comes from Elemental Enhancement. Reload and Weak Point are your best stats after that, and then rounds, fire rate, crit damage, and crit chance, and then your stat weightings for what you want to reroll in the weapon are in the top right here. So ideally reroll bonus versus Colossi, but if you wanted to get a faction or all the factions you could, it would just have a kind of a lower impact on overall, but would give you some nice burst damage there. So this is the base build for the weapon. Let's talk about how we would go about creating the optimal build for Wave of Light and what it requires you to do. And that comes down to the passive ability for Wave of Light, which has a whole bunch of different modifiers. And as far as all the testing that I can prove goes, has a bizarre implementation that is different than any other implementation in the entire game. I don't know if they meant to program it this way and implement it this way, but this is the way that it functions. So let's talk about it. You have two different portions to the Wave of Light passive. You're going to have a reload time modifier if you're below max unique ability. If you max this out and you get 4 duplicates off the base, this will be 0%. So this goes away. When you hit a target, so like after reloading, you get this Solar Halo buff. So you reload and you get a short period buff called Solar Halo. At max, this duration goes to 1.4 seconds, so it's very short. It's not that long of a buff, but right after you reload for 1.4 seconds, you will have a increase to firearm crit rate and a reduction to recoil. If you hit a target while the buff is active, the target will be drenched in water and they will have a healing regeneration reduction. It's an anti-healing debuff that works on some targets. It's not the end of the world. It's not super useful. There could be fights in the future where this becomes very useful. In this case, it really isn't. But it is something to be aware of. What we're going to focus on here is the Solar Halo buff that you add to yourself. And there's two main things to focus on for this buff. The first one is going to be the duration. At base, even with a maxed out weapon, you can only get about 4 or 5 rounds into the buff window in order to scale off of this extra crit rate. If you add fire rate up all the way up to maximum, you can get 6, maybe 7 shots in the window. So there was a question of if we can maximize this buff, do we want to go for attack speed to get more shots inside the damage window, or do we want to maximize the uptime of the damage window, right, by like reloading more often and running reload? How does that all work? The second piece of this buff that's super important to know is that this firearm critical hit rate is not multiplicative or additive. It is neither. For some strange reason, I don't know why, what this does when this buff activates is it sets your critical strike chance to exactly 45%. Even if you have better insight, if you have any crit chances added to the mod, it will set your crit rate to exactly 45%. Now, that's great in general because the base crit chance for this weapon is a measly 10%. So you pretty much just don't run crit chance. And the optimal build, we've run a whole bunch of different scenarios and calculations to see, should you run with longer, like more shots inside of the duration of the buff? Do you want more damage of those hits inside of the buff? Does the buff matter enough enough at all, or should we just, you know, use the weapon normally and ignore it? Because obviously we can shoot and then we can reload, and then while you are scoped in, you see that spinning circle, that's where the buff is active. It's very, very short period of time. And after running all of the numbers, all the calculations, all of the tests, it actually turns out the best usage for this weapon is to spend only time inside of that buff activation and reload as soon as it's done. It's super bizarre. It's a weird way to play, but the math checks out. It is actually insanely strong if you play exactly this way with reload modifiers. So a normal function for this build would be, you know, you reload, you shoot until the buff is gone, and then you reload. And then you shoot until the buff is gone, and then you reload. I'm not kidding. This is actually the optimal DPS for this weapon. The buff duration is 1.4 seconds. But getting your crit rate, your base crit rate set to 45% is actually enough to shoot this weapon to the moon, because on the weapon itself, it has a base firearm crit damage scaler of 180%, 1.8, and a base weak point scaler of 180%, 1.8, which means if you can set your base crit chance to 45% with a ridiculous 249 rounds per minute, which is like 4.17 rounds per second, this thing turns into a DPS monster that can actually rival, in many cases, things like Enduring Legacy if you're hitting weak points. It is insanely strong, but it's kind of weird. It's a bizarre way to play. So let's talk about the build and the stat weightings for this reload playstyle. So this is the reload build. In this case, since we're reloading every time we finish our buff window at 1.4 seconds, the gameplay loop is to reload, fire until the buff is gone for 1.4 seconds, and repeat, and just do that over and over, which means things like rounds don't matter. And because this isn't increasing your crit chance, it's not scaling your crit chance, it is hard setting, it is forcing your crit chance to be exactly 45%. Crit chance loses a bunch of value, and you can see up here in the reroll, I've actually put it at 0%, because anything under 45% is going to be lost. It includes when you have mods on. I tried every single mod that has crit chance on it, checked all the values, it sets it to 45% and calls it a day for that 1.4 seconds. So in this case, you're going to run with double reload. So Recycling Genius and Reload Focus is going to be your best choice. Weak point with Have Aiming, Weak Point Sight. Target detection and better concentration, because we already have a base 1.8 critical strike damage scaler, and then we just want a bunch of firearm attack on top of it. It's still going to be your best bet to run Real Life Fighter, but if you don't want to try and keep it up, the main reason here is that Sharp Precision Shot and Mental Focus lose their buff when you reload, and since you're reloading all the time, you get almost no value out of those two mods, unfortunately, but Real Life Fighter will maintain when you reload, which is useful. And you can also get some value out of Payout as well, since we are kind of using up that ammo a lot. And if you wanted to, you could swap out like Weak Point Sight for maximum impact rounds. Weak Point Sight is the last one here. Is not, you know, the value on it is low enough that you can put almost any mod you wanted in this last slot. So if you wanted more accuracy, less recoil, if you wanted maximum impact rounds so that you can carry more ammo and use the weapon more often, this gives you a lot of freedom, because you're not having to run extra rounds in the magazine since you're reloading before you're empty anyway, and you don't have to run crit chance because it gets replaced by the buff anyways. So those stats go away, the stat weighting opens up and gives you more freedom with the lower weighted on the modules here. So this would be the build for the Wave of Light reload, and you can see that the DPS jumps up to 991,000 DPS, which is around Enduring Legacy level. If you're willing to play this weird, bizarre playstyle and the buff stays the same without them having to change it, like, you know, at some point, if they decide that they want to rework how this is implemented and make it a multiplicative or additive stat bonus, then the weightings here change quite a bit, because it could end up being quite different for the buff. If it ends up being additive, it's going to be quite close. And technically, since your base crit chance is 10% and it goes up to 45%, this weird implementation gives you 35% more additive, and if it becomes 45% more additive, that's actually better than the way it is now. But if it becomes multiplicative, it takes your crit down to 14.5%, which is obviously not really as tenable as what we're having here. Then your weightings for these at the top, you want to weight reload. You want both reload mods, and you want to max them out quickly, because you're going to be reloading so much that all your throughput time is going to be reliant on your reload time. Then we have bonus versus attack, crit damage super high because we have high crit chance, firearm attack, and flat elemental damage are going to be your best 4 re-rolls. And then if you can work in weak point. Like if weak point replaced one of these, like flat elemental damage, that would be fine too, because you still have great weak point scaling. And with this weapon, it's very easy to hit the weak point consistently. And I do want to make sure that you're aware that like, unlike some of the unique abilities in this game that don't have any visual representation whatsoever, some of the mods have no feedback to the player at all. They just happen in the background and there's no visual. Luckily, this one does. So you have two different ways to know when your buff is active. The first one is if you shoot and reload, you actually do get a buff icon for Solar Halo. You can see it pops up and then it goes away there. But also they've implemented a graphical representation of as well that we talked about earlier. If you reload and then immediately scope in, those orange circles denote the buff time. So you can actually see, like, you literally will just scope in and shoot until those circles are gone and then reload. Shoot until the circles are gone and then reload. And you're like, quite literally, this build is actually insanely effective and ridiculous. I get it if some people don't want to play that way and you'd much rather do like the basic build that's a little bit more reasonable, but you are going to have more damage potential running with this bizarro build for the Wave of Light. So that's the Wave of Light. Even without this playstyle, it is still the best scout rifle in the game right now until we see other changes. Unfortunately, Blue Beetle is like just under 800k, so it's a little bit less than the Wave of Light, but of course it does have dispels and things like that, which makes it a little bit more of a niche choice for specific situations. I think the Blue Beetle looks cooler than this, but that is the Wave of Light. Let me know if you're looking forward to the last few weapons remaining. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.